visit with us this evening. Enough, my novel Enough, is a story about what happens when principled journalism collides with the corrupt brand of politics in a fictional southern West Virginia county. And we'll get to that. I'll go through some of the plot as we get along in the presentation. Now, I'd like to start with two things. One, I want to look a little bit at fake news and how it's got a foothold in politics today, and then talk a little bit about how freedom of the press got in our First Amendment in our Bill of Rights. Now, fake news has come to mean, and I wrote a letter to my local paper, I guess about 3 weeks ago, and I was talking about fake news has become to mean news with which we disagree. And it's gotten popular recently, but I'll go into how it's really been around for a long time. Now, if the press, and I'm talking about newspapers, radio, television, and all of the social media sites, if they're doing their job, they're going to make politicians mad of Republican side and the Democratic side. Public officials are going to make mistakes, and they're very thin-skinned when those mistakes are pointed out by the press. So if you ask a public official what they think about the press, well, they're going to say, well, they're no good, they don't know what they're talking about, and they're always out to get me. Well, then we run up to what fake news is about and how it's gotten popular. Now, I'd like to say that Mount Vernon, a website run by Mount Vernon, says that a major reason that George Washington didn't run for re-election in 1796 was because of the bad press he was getting. So having trouble with the press is not something that just started with the president occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, there's two reasons I think that fake news is getting traction now. One, the president uses it at rallies to fire up his supporters. But there's another reason, and that is reporters today don't seem to take care in confirming their information. You have to be accurate and you have to be fair. And when a reporter makes a mistake in a story, particularly a national story, it gives a bad name to the whole news industry and everybody connected with it, and that gives fake news traction. Now, I've known hundreds of reporters throughout my career, and not many of them will make a mistake on purpose. Most of them try to be fair and accurate. And when I was a journalism professor at the university, or Susquehanna University in Pennsylvania, that's what I taught my students. You've got to be fair and you have to be accurate. Don't let bias seep into your news stories. Now, there's a place in the press for opinions, and that's on the editorial pages. And the editorial pages can get, well, they can get a little dicey, and they make everybody mad. And that goes all the way back to our colonial history. And if that's the case about the press, how in the world did freedom of the press get into our First Amendment? Well, the founding fathers, I think, were very wise. They recognized the importance of the free press, but they didn't try to control it, didn't try to restrict it, and didn't even try to license it. They made the press an independent, non-government institution to hold public officials accountable. And that's how freedom of the press got in the First Amendment. Now, let's think about that just a minute. About 240 years ago, these politicians, the founding fathers, who had been vilified by the colonial press, gave us an independent way to hold public officials accountable. Now, I don't think we have any public officials today, at least none I know about, who would have such vision. Now, before I got involved, or before we get to enough, I want to give you some idea of my background in West Virginia politics. Now, those of you who are from West Virginia, I'm from Logan County. Those of you who are not from West Virginia, Logan County had a reputation for being one of the most politically corrupt counties in the state back in 1960. In fact, we had a saying in Logan County: we never discriminated against a person's right to vote just because they're dead. Now that gives you a chuckle maybe, but isn't it a tragedy to think people would conspire to lessen the impact of legally cast votes? And that's what enough's about. We look at a corrupt political faction and what a terrible impact it can have on a community. Now, my experience with Southern West Virginia politics started when I was 12 years old at the Logan Central Junior High School precinct, voting precinct. And I was out there handing out cards for a fellow that was a friend of my parents running for the school board. Back then, you could hand out cards as people went into the polls. And I noticed these men were coming to vote, and they'd go over in the parking lot and they'd go from car to car to car before they went in to vote. And I asked a buddy of my, another fellow there passing out literature, I said, what is going on? And he explained to me they were going back from car to car, trying to see who would pay them the most money for their vote. Well, I said, how are they going to know how they vote? He pointed to a window and said, watch that window. And that was in the classroom where the voting was taking place. And about that time, a poll worker came to the window, scratched his cheek, and he said, there, that was the signal the fellow voted right. Fella came out of the polling place and got his money or liquor for his vote. Then some years later, my education into West Virginia politics continued. My dad told me about the chain ballot. And the chain ballot was interesting. If you wanted to sell your vote, you would go up to the parking lot outside the precinct and make connections with somebody, and you'd agree on what they'd pay you. And they'd give the individual a blank sheet of paper folded about the size of the ballot. And that individual put it in his pants pocket, go into the voting place, sign his name, get a real ballot, go into the voting booth, pull the curtain back, take the blank piece of paper out, fold the real ballot, put it in his pocket, come out of the voting booth real quick and put the blank piece of paper in the ballot box. He'd go outside, give the unmarked ballot to the vote buyer and get his money or liquor. Well, the vote buyer would mark that ballot for his candidates, fold that ballot, give it to the next vote seller. That vote seller would go in with the pre-marked ballot, sign in, get his ballot, go into the voting booth, pull the curtain, take the pre-marked ballot out, put the unmarked ballot in his pocket, go out and put the marked ballot in the ballot box, go outside, give the new ballot to the vote buyer, and that was the chain ballot. Now, I draw on all these experience in enough. But when I started to write enough, I had to select a time period. When would I set this? There really was only one choice. The West Virginia Democratic presidential primary in May of 1960, where John Kennedy was running against Hubert Humphrey. And it was a heck of a race. And I'll go into some of the issues, including his religion, that faced John Kennedy. Now, my dad, who at that time had been covering West Virginia politics with the Logan Banner for about 15 or 20 years. After that election, he said it was the dirtiest he'd ever seen when it came to voter fraud and the role that money played in that election. Well, years later, maybe 15 or 20 years later, researching for the book, I got to talk to a fella that participated in that 1960 election. And his name was Claude Big Daddy Ellis, a political force unparalleled in Logan County. And I remember the day or the Friday after that Tuesday primary, he was driving the biggest black Cadillac or almost a limousine I'd ever seen. So when I finally got to meet with him, I said, Claude, where'd that car come from? And he just laughed and said, you remember that car? I said, hell, everybody in Logan County remembered that car. I said, where'd you get the money? And he looked at me and just smiled. He said, yeah, I got that money working on the election. And it was a pretty good car. And then he started laughing again and told me about another West Virginia political power, Raymond Chafin. Raymond in 1960 was chairman of the Logan County Democrat Executive Committee. And that's a very powerful committee when elections roll around. Raymond was a Hubert Humphrey supporter, one of the strongest in the state. He didn't want a Catholic to be elected president. Well, Raymond also worked for A.T. Massey Coal Company over in Richmond. And about 6 or 8 weeks before the election, an official from A.T. Massey came to visit with Raymond. And he explained that A.T. Massey sold a lot of coal to a company in Boston, Massachusetts, controlled by Joseph Kennedy. Now that's John Kennedy's father. So this A.T. Massey official gave Raymond 2 choices. 1, support John Kennedy. 2, or find a new job. Well, Raymond put his pocketbook above his political principles and said, I'm all in for Kennedy. Well, the next day, Kennedy campaign staffer from Charleston called Raymond. Said, Raymond, we're so glad you're with us in this election. We want to help you. How much money do you need in order to set up a precinct operation in Logan County for John Kennedy? Well, Raymond was real suspicious. He thought maybe somebody was tapping into the phone call or might be listening to the conversation. So Raymond said 35. Well, Raymond meant 3,500. The Kennedy fella thought he meant 35,000. So a couple days later, 2 of Kennedy's staffers came to Logan County and delivered $35,000 cash in 2 suitcases to Raymond Chafin. Now, I'm not telling you a rumor. Raymond confirmed that in a book years later. Now, the statute of limitations had already run out and he couldn't be prosecuted. As an aside, I got to meet John Kennedy in Logan. I was a senior in high school, walking home from school one day. He was coming out of the old Logan County courthouse. I went up and chatted with him, and he was polite and everything. And then at my high school senior prom at intermission, Hubert Humphrey spoke, and he told us to go home and tell our parents to vote for him. That gives you an idea of how heated that campaign was. Now, John Kennedy was hit all over the country for being a Catholic. And it's hard to believe today, but people actually thought if a Catholic was elected president, they would be run by the Pope in the Vatican. Preachers all across southern West Virginia were preaching sermons about that. And John Kennedy decided he had to win in a heavily Protestant state. And he selected West Virginia. And that's the setting for my book, Enough. Now, that's about my political experience in West Virginia. My parents and I, on the journalism side, my parents who had been in the newspaper business for years, and I bought the Hylton Daily News down in Summers County, which is below Beckley. And at the Hylton Daily News, I had the opportunity to cover local government, city council, board of education, and county commission. And I was able to see the influence that political bodies could have on an entire community, every facet of a community. And the difficulties that a small town newspaper had in covering that. Well, in Enough, while it's fiction, I'll give you a little background. Enough is about a small town publisher of the Lonsville Crier who takes on a corrupt political machine. Now, the former publisher of the Crier didn't cover local government. He was very close to the crooked political faction. And he kept all bad news out, no letters to the editor criticizing, and the only candidates that got publicity were the O-line candidates. Well, Rick Hill, the new publisher, started covering local government bodies. And at first, people didn't believe the story. He was writing how public money was spent, what decisions were made. People just didn't believe it. And then they started watching. And then they started questioning the O-line political faction candidates and office holders. And two political kingpins in the county, and it takes place in the fictional Jordan County in southern West Virginia, they started seeing the influence that the Crier was having and saw it as a threat to their political power. And they set in motion a conspiracy that burned the paper to the ground and hatched a plot to murder the young publisher on a deserted country road. Enough shows how a corrupt political machine can thrive when a free press doesn't do its job of holding public officials accountable. And it shows the behind the scenes maneuvering of how politicians use public bodies to get power and to enrich themselves. And Enough does a little more than that. It explores life-threatening challenges that the underdog publisher faced when trying to bring the truth to the people of Jordan County. And it focuses on news coverage in a small town, how a wild rumor, when tracked down and confirmed, can become a major news story. And some news tips today and then come from people who have an axe to grind. That doesn't mean they're not true, but they must be tracked down for fairness and accuracy. Now, Enough is set in a very small town. And if you've ever lived in a small town, you know that small towns are just full of characters. I mean, they're everywhere. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples here in Enough, some of the characters. Now, Rick Hill, the publisher, one of his best news sources, was an 85-year-old, nearly bedridden woman who hardly ever got out of her house. But she knew everything going on in town and would call Rick with news tips all the time, and all of them proved to be true. And then there was an 85-year-old retired teacher who very quietly moved about town, knew what was going on. She got disgusted with what the politicians were doing to this county school system. And then we had the town drunk. Now, the town drunk, Lester Brown, he moved around town at night in the shadows and was able to see what was going on. And he would supply news tips every now and then to the crier publisher. But then we go to the fount of all knowledge in town, and that's the beauty parlor. And one of the biggest stories in Enough, one of the biggest news stories, comes from there when a wife of one of the local politicians, in for her regular Friday blonding, bragged about an intimidating, illegal political move made by her husband. Well, before that woman could get home, Rick's 85-year-old news source had him the full story. Now, the key question in Enough, and it's asked very succinctly, can the black ink on the pages of the Crier newspaper overcome the green ink on the mountains of cash the crooked politicians spend to keep their corrupt political machine in power? Is it possible that we, the people, rise up and with their ballots defeat the crooks that had ruled Jordan County for decades? Rick Hill, the Crier publisher, has little confidence that that will happen. Again, I want to thank you for being with us, and I'm glad to take any questions you might have.
How long did it take you to write it, Tony? How many drafts did you go through?
Well, Wayne, I worked on it probably 15 or 20 years. And then when I retired in 2009, I moved to a log cabin out in the woods here near Morgantown, West Virginia. And I really got to working on it and worked on it, I guess 6 or 8 years. Finally got it to publisher in 2000, late 16, early 17. And the number of drafts, full drafts, it had to be at least 4 or 5.
So did you self-publish or did you get an agent?
No, I am published by Headline Books. It's in Terre Haute, West Virginia.
Right.
Headline Books, run by Kathy Teach, has been judged countless times as the best small independent book publisher in the country. And that's my publisher. And for those of you on the call, Wayne Hughes and I were stationed together in Vietnam back in 1969, and he's written, what, 3 or 4 books, Wayne?
I'm working on a third. I'm about done with the third.
Okay, working on the third. Okay, very good. Thanks for the question, Wayne.